Imagine waking up one day with a strange quietness in your chest, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like someone pressed a mute button on the world. No messages. No expectations. Nobody is reaching for you, and you are reaching for no one. At first, it feels like relief, like the world has finally loosened its grip on your spine. But then a different sensation follows, a faint, almost imperceptible echo. A feeling that something has slipped out of place inside you. And you wonder, when did I start drifting away? And why does part of me not want to come back? There are 7 million ways a human being can disappear without ever leaving the room. You can respond with, "I'm fine," until the phrase becomes a ritual mask. You can sit in a crowd and feel as if you've been sealed behind glass. You can watch friendships fade like fog on a cold morning and tell yourself it's natural, even though some secret part of you feels the tear. Or maybe you wake up one day and realize you no longer know how to let people close, not because they hurt you, but because the thought of being seen feels more dangerous than the loneliness that follows. What makes a person choose distance over connection? What invisible force inside you chooses retreat instead of reaching out? What truth does your silence protect? You might tell yourself it's exhaustion, or self-preservation, or simply adulthood. And some days, that explanation works. Other days, it feels like a flimsy shield held against a storm that has no intention of stopping. As you move through your life, you begin noticing the small signs. You flinch internally when someone asks how you're really doing. You cancel plans not because you're busy, but because you're not sure which version of yourself you're supposed to bring. You feel safer pulling away, even though the distance sometimes burns. And yet, here's the paradox. You distance yourself to avoid being misunderstood, but the more you withdraw, the more misunderstood you feel. You isolate to protect your inner world, but in the silence, that inner world grows heavier. You avoid emotional risk, but in doing so, you create the very emptiness you fear. It's like living behind a door you're convinced you cannot open, but you've never actually tried the handle. Maybe you've wondered whether something is wrong with you. Why does the connection feel harder than it should? Why the warmth of closeness feels too bright, too sharp, too demanding? Maybe you've convinced yourself you function better alone, yet a quiet voice keeps whispering at night that better doesn't necessarily mean whole. Psychology says people who distance themselves are not inherently cold, broken, or indifferent. Often they are the ones who once cared too deeply. The ones who once felt too intensely. The ones who learned, slowly, painfully, that closeness can cut deeper than absence. And so, they reshape themselves into shadows of who they used to be, hoping that if they become unreachable, they might also become untouchable. But here is the great question, the one that lingers no matter how far you pull away. Are you distancing yourself because you're protecting your heart? Or because you no longer trust yourself to share it? The answer isn't obvious. It rarely is. Because beneath the surface lies something older and more intricate than simple avoidance. Something woven through your memories, your beliefs, your fears, your unspoken disappointments. Something that psychology has tried to name but never fully contains. Something that philosophy has questioned for centuries. What is the true cost of withdrawing from others? And what truth are you hiding from when you do? Perhaps you've noticed that isolation doesn't always begin with a decision. Sometimes, it begins with a feeling, a tightening in the chest, a subtle fatigue, a soft resignation that whispers, "It's easier this way." But is it really easier? Or is it simply familiar? As you sit with these questions, the silence around you shifts. It doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels intentional, almost heavy, as if the part of you that has been asleep is beginning to stir. Because deep down, you know this isn't just about solitude. It's about a fracture you've learned to live with. A fracture that psychology can explain, but only if you're willing to look at it directly. And so, the stage is set. You stand at the edge of a truth you've avoided for years, maybe without ever realizing it. A truth that reveals why you distance yourself, and what that distance has been doing to you. Take a breath. The next step goes deeper. You tell yourself you're just tired, that people simply require too much, that the world has become too loud to hold space for anyone else. But exhaustion is only the surface. Beneath it lies a far older story, one written by your past, your unconscious, and the architecture of your inner world. Carl Jung once said that what we ignore within ourselves eventually becomes our fate. If you trace the roots of your self-imposed distance far enough back, you eventually find something that was never fully healed, only buried. A moment when vulnerability felt unsafe. A disappointment that splits something delicate inside you. A betrayal, sometimes subtle, sometimes catastrophic, that reshaped your definition of closeness. You didn't withdraw because you lacked the desire for connection. You withdrew because the connection started to feel like a battlefield where you were always one mistake away from losing something important. And so your psyche built a fortress, not out of stone, but out of silence. Yet psychological walls are never built consciously. They rise quietly, brick by brick, through repeated experiences that whisper the same message. You're safer at a distance. As you grow older, the walls don't disappear. They simply become part of your personality, blending in with your habits, your preferences, your identity. Schopenhauer believed that human beings oscillate between suffering and boredom, pulled toward others by desire, pushed away by the pain they inevitably bring. For the one who distances themselves, this oscillation becomes a kind of spiritual vertigo. You crave closeness, yet recoil from it. You long to be understood, yet fear being known. You want to be held, yet mistrust the hands reaching for you. So you create a third path, exist near people, but not with them. This hidden problem grows most powerfully in the unconscious. You begin to mistake emotional numbness for peace. You confuse withdrawal with maturity. You wear self-reliance like armor, even though it sometimes feels more like chains disguised as strength. But here's the truth. Humans don't distance themselves without reason. Even Sartre, who believed hell is other people, acknowledged that isolation can warp the self. He argued that we understand who we are through how others perceive us. So when you retreat completely, you begin losing access to parts of yourself you didn't even know depended on connection for oxygen. And society, in its strange contradictions, encourages the withdrawal. On one hand, you're praised for being independent, self-contained, and low maintenance. On the other hand, you're told to seek connection, community, vulnerability. You can't win. You're asked to be both invulnerable and emotionally open. So you choose the only option that feels bearable. You disappear from the very relationships that could reveal who you really are. But this disappearance comes at a price. Slowly, distance stops being something you do and becomes something you are. You feel the consequences approaching, even if you can't name them yet. A kind of existential weight. A slow erosion of meaning. A dull ache that grows louder in the moments when everything else finally becomes quiet. You sense there's something deeper at play, some unseen current pulling you toward isolation even as part of you reaches toward the light. And that tension is only the beginning. You don't notice the consequences at first. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary moments, a hesitation before answering a message, a sigh you can't explain, a sudden urge to retreat when someone smiles too warmly. But over time, these fragments accumulate, shaping the architecture of your inner world in ways you never consciously agreed to. Distance becomes a habit. Then a reflex. Then a worldview. Cognitive psychology explains that the human brain is designed to seek patterns, even in emotional experience. If closeness once brought pain, your mind begins associating connection with danger, and danger with withdrawal. This becomes a bias, a silent algorithm running beneath your awareness. Pull back before you get pulled under. It's not logical. It's conditioning. A survival script encoded through repetition. But here's the part that catches most people off guard. Your brain cannot distinguish between emotional survival and emotional stagnation. So while it protects you from hurt, it also quietly starves you of nourishment. Social neuroscientists have shown that isolation activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Not metaphorically, literally. The same part of the brain that aches when you are wounded flares when you are lonely. Which means every time you retreat, your nervous system absorbs a cut you can't see. And over time, these invisible wounds bleed into your identity. You begin to mistrust your own perceptions. You wonder whether people actually care, or if their warmth is temporary. You question your worth in quiet moments, replaying interactions with forensic precision, searching for the mistake you're certain you made. The world starts to feel slightly out of reach, as if you're observing life through a window instead of living inside it. This separation reshapes not just relationships, but your internal narrative. You tell yourself stories like, "I work better alone. No one really understands me. I don't need anyone. It's safer if I keep to myself." But beneath these phrases lies a deeper message. "I'm not sure I would survive another disappointment." Aldous Huxley warned that humans often create illusions to escape discomfort, but the escape becomes its own prison. That's what distance does. It liberates you just enough for the cage to feel comfortable. And the world around you reinforces this cage. Our culture celebrates the lone wolf, the hyper-independent achiever, the emotionally unshakable figure who needs nothing and no one. But wolves were never meant to hunt alone. And neither were you. The consequence of isolation isn't just loneliness, it's distortion. Your sense of self becomes skewed. Your emotional range narrows. Your capacity for connection weakens like a muscle that hasn't been used in years. You start interpreting neutral expressions as rejection, silence as disapproval, and closeness as obligation. Your brain becomes hypervigilant, scanning for threats that aren't there. This is the paradox. The more you distance yourself, the more threatening the world appears. But the most haunting consequence is this. Distance slowly convinces you that you are unworthy of being reached. Not because it's true, but because the absence of contact begins to feel like proof. The silence you once chose becomes the silence you cannot escape. The fortress becomes a labyrinth. And the loneliness that once protected you becomes the very thing you need protection from. You begin to feel the weight of this realization, not fully, but enough to sense that something inside you is shifting. Something is waking up. And with that awakening comes a question you can no longer ignore. If this distance is a shield, why does it feel more like a wound? The answer lies in what comes next, the moment you stop accepting the narrative you inherited, and begin rewriting the one you were meant to live. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when your solitude stops feeling like a sanctuary and starts feeling like a room with the air slowly thinning. Not dangerous enough to force escape, but restrictive enough that staying becomes a choice you can no longer justify. This moment is the beginning of rebellion, though it rarely feels dramatic. It feels more like a whisper from within, there must be another way. Breaking free doesn't begin with forcing yourself into crowds or oversharing your truth. It begins with something far more radical, challenging the belief that distance is your destiny. Psychology tells us that avoidance is a strategy, not a personality. Strategies can be unlearned. Patterns can be rewired. Even the most deeply conditioned responses can be softened by new experiences. But to break free, you must first recognize that you are not escaping other people, you are escaping the parts of yourself that were once wounded in their presence. And this rebellion is internal. Nietzsche believed that transformation begins with a confrontation, with the shadow, the wound, the truth we refuse to face. Your rebellion starts there, by turning toward the very thing you've spent years avoiding. That may mean acknowledging the heartbreak you minimized, the betrayal you intellectualized, the self-doubt you dismissed as not a big deal. It may mean admitting that your independence was forged not from freedom, but from fear. Rebellion is honesty. Rebellion is awareness. Rebellion is saying, I deserve to be understood, even by myself. But breaking free doesn't require the demolition of your walls. It requires learning how to open a door in them. Consider Viktor Frankl's insight that meaning, not comfort, is what allows humans to endure. Your connections don't need to be flawless, they need to be meaningful. And meaning often begins with one small, uncomfortable act of courage, replying to the message you were avoiding, admitting you're not actually fine. Allowing someone to see a fraction of the chaos you've kept hidden. This rebellion is not dramatic. It's subtle, steady, almost imperceptible from the outside. It looks like choosing presence over withdrawal. It looks like a challenge to the reflex to disappear. It looks like giving others a chance, even when your past insists it's safer not to. Breaking free is not about erasing your loneliness. It's about refusing to worship it. And as you begin this shift, something unexpected happens. The world softens. Not because people change, but because you do. You no longer approach connection as a battlefield or a test. You approach it as a possibility, fragile, imperfect, but real. And possibility is the birthplace of transformation. What comes next is the final step, the deepest revelation, the truth that rewrites everything you thought you understood about distance, closeness, and yourself. There is a moment, usually unexpected, often unwelcome, when you finally see the truth beneath your distance. It doesn't arrive as a lightning strike or a dramatic epiphany. It arrives as a soft, undeniable understanding. You never withdrew from people, you withdrew from the version of yourself that people once hurt. That's the ultimate truth. Not that you are bad at connection. Not that you are cold, or broken, or different. But that somewhere along your life's timeline, a more vulnerable version of you was wounded, misunderstood, dismissed, or betrayed, and you promised yourself you would never let it happen again. The distance wasn't the problem. It was the shield. A shield you built with good reason. And yet, here is the revelation that changes everything. You are no longer the version of yourself who needed that shield. You've survived things your younger self couldn't imagine. You've carried weights you never received credit for. You've walked through emotional storms that would have broken other people, and still, you kept going. Your isolation wasn't a weakness, it was an adaptation. But every adaptation has an expiration date. At some point, the strategies that once protected you begin to confine you, like a cast that must be removed for the bone to grow stronger. And when you finally realize this, something inside you shifts. The loneliness you thought defined you becomes something else entirely. A message, not a verdict. A signal that you are ready to grow beyond the walls you built. Here is the deeper truth. You were never distancing yourself from others. You were preparing to return to yourself. And returning to yourself is the beginning of genuine connection, not the performative kind, not the forced kind, not the exhausting kind, but the kind that flows naturally when you no longer fear being seen. Frankl called this the defiant power of the human spirit, the ability to choose meaning even in the face of suffering. Jung described it as individuation, the process of reclaiming the parts of yourself you abandoned. But you don't need philosophy to tell you what your heart already knows. You are allowed to outgrow your loneliness. You are allowed to shed the armor that has grown too heavy. You are allowed to re-enter the world without apologizing for the time you needed to heal. And the truth, the ultimate truth, is this. Connection is not the opposite of distance. Connection is the reward for surviving it. Your solitude carved depth into you. Your silence sharpened your perception. Your retreat taught you who you are when the world isn't watching. Now you stand at a threshold, one you've approached many times without realizing it. You are not being asked to leap, or to expose every wound, or to suddenly trust without question. You are being asked only to take one step forward. One moment of openness. One breath of permission. Because the world is not waiting for a perfect version of you. It is waiting for the real you, the one who has traveled through distance and returned with wisdom. And as this script closes, the question that opened everything returns, transformed. If you no longer need the distance to survive, what will you build with the space it leaves behind? The answer is yours now. Your story continues from here.